Hey, John Gilroy here. Today we're going to dive into compliance, and the takeaway is that technology does not mean compliance. Hit the music, Manny. Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast, the podcast that connects you to federal technology leaders. My name is John Gilroy, and I'll be your moderator in the virtual studios. Travis Goldbach, he is the Vice President, CMMC for Coalfire Federal, and we're going to dive into a four-letter word, CMMC. Do you really want to jump in there, Travis?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on today, John.
Yeah. Well, I deal with some big companies everyone knows, and some medium-sized companies and small, and I think most of my audience has heard of Coalfire Federal. I mean, it's a pretty well-known name here in the Washington, D.C. area, and I thought I'd do is I'd bring Travis in and say, okay, people may have heard of you. Maybe they saw you at a trade show. Maybe saw you speak at, Billington or something. And maybe you can keep us up to speed with what's going on, update our audience with what Coalfire can do for our federal audience. And maybe today we're not focused on the government itself. Maybe we're focused on the suppliers for the DOD. I mean, Travis, there's only 300,000 of them, are there?
Yeah, that's what they say, 300,000. I mean, it really could be into the millions, and no one knows how many defense contractors there really are.
Yeah. In Marketing 101, they try to define your total addressable market, your TAM. Let's say your TAM is 300,000. So we have 300,000 companies that are part of the supply chain for the DOD, and they have to comply with this little tiny regulation called CMMC. So give us a perspective, maybe 2019 till now. It seems to have gone like cycles. Interested, no interest, interested, no interest. I see with cycle up now where CMMC is really getting more and more important for acquisition.
Yeah, absolutely. It's getting way more important for acquisition. There's many defense contractors out there that haven't even started to get ready for these requirements, and it's quite upsetting. I've spoke at a number of conferences, and there's always some small business members that are even speaking at those conferences, and they said, we're waiting till the requirements actually come out. And well, you know what? They have. The requirements are here. You better get started.
Yeah, I think I've seen some things with NIST and everything else. And so CMMC 2.0, so the latest iteration and compliance, when did that come out anyway? Is that 2025?
Yeah, November 2025. That's when the DFARS requirement went into place, making sure that contractors are actually implementing the controls of the NIST 800-171.
So let's kind of view this in perspective from the last few years. So in the last 3 years, what's been the biggest shift in how federal contractors, they view CMMC, from checkbox to actual compliance? So what's happened?
Yeah, I would say that, 3 years ago, many contractors were still asking, do we really need to do this? Now, the conversation's actually changed. How can we keep our contracts, protect our position in the supply chain, and prove that we can be trusted with CUI? That's a major change. So CMMC is now tied directly to the ability to compete or retain the Department of Defense or Department of War work. If a company handles federal contract information or controlled unclassified information, cybersecurity is no longer just an IT responsibility. It's a business requirement that's going to affect sales, legal, operation, finance, supply chain, and executive leadership. So the practical shift is this, companies that treat CMMC as a one-time documentation project are going to struggle. There's going to be companies that treat this as an enterprise risk and growth strategy, and they'll be in a better position to win work, support the prime contractors, and protect the sensitive government information. So phase one, as we previously talked about, was implemented and began November 10th of 2025 with level one, which is 15 requirements from the FAR 52.204.21, and level two, which is 110 controls from the NIST 800-171 to really enter into these types of contracts. Some of the level two assessments right now will need to be conducted by a CMMC third-party assessment organization, which That's what Coalfire Federal is, a CMMC third-party assessment organization. We're going to go in and verify that an organization is meeting those 110 controls across their environment that handles CUI. There's also going to be every 3 years a requirement to go back through the assessment with annual affirmations from senior officials. So that's what's really changed over the last 3 years. It's no longer a checkbox like they were doing with the DFAR 7012 requirement and just saying, I meet these requirements. We're now making sure that organizations are implementing these controls appropriately across their organization.
I should let the audience know that if I fire up your YouTube and you type in Coalfire Federal, you get world famous Travis Goldbach with a pretty good 40-minute interview that dives into a lot of these topics we're kind of just hitting the mountaintops on today. So I thought that was a real good job in that video. I think these explainer videos, I think these are just wonderful because, so you're listening to podcasts and you go, oh, I don't know about this Travis guy. Then you go to YouTube and then you have another half hour Travis and go, well, maybe he's getting beat up and knocked around and maybe we'll feel. And I think that's a good follow up on these audio discussions one in of itself. I always do my go on.
I was just going to say, I've been involved in the CMMC ecosystem since essentially the idea was introduced back in 2020. Over the last 5 years before I came to Coalfire Federal, I actually worked at a company called AWS, just a little bookstore that some people know about. But I led CMMC go-to-market efforts there. I led the internal environment, which handled controlled unclassified information, federal contract information, ITAR restricted data. And I would say definitely go look at some of my other videos because I really dive into the requirements and how organizations can be successful throughout their journey of the CMMC.
In order for me to be successful, I got to do some research on these silly interviews I do. And so I was researching and reading some odds and ends. And here's what some people say is that, CMMC 2.0 simplified parts of the original framework. And I write down simplified. Then listen to Travis, I write down 110. I go, well, is this simplified? What do you mean by simplified? It go from 10,000 to 110? Or what does this mean?
Yeah, so really what they did was make the model more understandable and more aligned to the requirements that contractors already knew. So we talked about the NIST 800-171 being a contractual requirement within the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement 252-204-7012. From there, they added in this new component, which builds on top of that to have an assessment done. But they did move from 5 levels to 3 levels to really help reduce that confusion. So level 1 is focused on the basic cyber hygiene for safeguarding federal contract information. Level 2 is focused on protecting CUI through the 110 NIST 800-171 requirements. And level 3 actually builds on top of that. And it's more focused on advanced protection using a select number. I think it's 24. It is 24 requirements from the NIST 800-172. And that really gave a simplified version and a cleaner path for these defense contractors. But I would say the most important practical change is that CMMC 2.0 didn't create a completely new cybersecurity universe. It actually aligned more directly with existing federal requirements, especially the NIST 800-171. And that matters because contractors now can focus less on really interpreting the new framework and more on proving that the controls are actually implemented and operating. So the supply chain impact is also significant. Primes now have to think more seriously about their suppliers, how they handle CUI, whether those suppliers are actually ready, how those suppliers' readiness actually affects their contracts. So the burden is not just on the primes' internal environment anymore. It extends across the entire supplier ecosystem. So the simplification actually helped, but it didn't make CMMC easy. It made it more the expectations clearer.
I've done a bunch of podcasts. In fact, I'm putting together an article, 10 mistakes podcasters make. 10 mistakes you guess make a podcast. No. I'm just thinking about, hey, let's put my hat on you. And hey, Travis is going to write a blog, but 10 mistakes that people make with trying to move to 2.0 CMMC. So what do you see as Joe Sixpack, Gilroy software out there? What are really typical kind of problems, challenges that they see? that may not even think they have.
Sure. Yeah, I would say the biggest mistake companies make is believing that documentation equals readiness. So
Huh.
documentation is important. You need a system security plan, you need policies, you need procedures, you need evidence. But mature cybersecurity is about whether the organization is actually doing what the documentation says it does. So, for example, a company may have an access control policy, but if the users are not reviewed, privilege accounts are not monitored, multi-factor authentication isn't consistently applied, and terminated employees aren't removed quickly, then documentation doesn't reflect the real reality. I would say the second big mistake is treating CMMC as a project instead of an operating model. A company may spend months preparing for an assessment, but after that assessment, the controls begin to drift. That's where maturity matters. So maturity or mature companies build repeatable processes for evidence collection, vulnerability management, access reviews, incident responses, configuration management, and supplier oversight. And then I would say the third mistake is not clearly defining their CUI boundaries. So if you don't know where your CUI enters, or where it's stored, or who has access to it, or how it moves throughout your organization, or even where it exists, you can't confidently scope your environment. So poor scoping leads to unnecessary costs, failed assessments, or even unmanaged risk. So my advice is simple. Documentation should be described as reality. If it doesn't, fix the process first, then update your documentation.
You mentioned annual reviews here, and boy, in my world, hard to say gaze into the crystal ball here. But what do you think companies should expect from assessments going beyond 2026 here?
Yeah, so I would say from an assessment perspective, really the role of a third-party assessment organization like us has become more and more important and much more formal. In the early stages, many companies reviewed or viewed assessors as people who would simply validate a checklist. That's not what this is becoming. C3PAOs like Coalfire Federal are being asked to provide an independent assurance that the contractor actually is meeting the requirements necessary for protecting CUI. In 2026 and beyond, companies should really expect assessments to be more evidence-driven, more structured, more focused, and consistency across the board. Assessors will want to come in and see the implemented controls, not just the policies. They're going to look for interviews, demonstrations, technical evidence, configuration and screenshots, logs, tickets, system outputs, and proof that the processes are actually operating over time. So companies should also expect the assessor to care deeply about the scope. If your CUI boundary is unclear, your assessment will be affected. And if your evidence is disorganized, your assessment will be harder. And if your team cannot explain specifically how the controls operate, then that's a problem. So I would say the best way to prepare is to really conduct a readiness review or even a mock assessment to really validate your scope, clean up your evidence, make sure the control owners understand their responsibilities, and not just waiting until the assessment to discover these gaps.
Travis, when I was in college many years ago, back with Ben Franklin, I read a book by an economist, and he had a book called Small is Beautiful. It's kind of interesting about small business. I think small business has got to be part of this discussion here. We started off with this silly little banter about number of contractors, 300,000. But I think what people say, maybe 300,000, something like that. But what they don't argue about is the vast majority of small businesses that are part of that. That could be 60, 70% are small business. So let's talk
Correct.
about the little guy here, not talk about AWS. Let's talk about Gilroy Software down the street or something. Small contractors worry that CMMC requirements favor the big dogs. So
Yes.
what advice would you give little Gilroy Software down the street? Tell them to lock up shop and get into the grass cutting business? Or so what about these little guys?
Yeah, so I completely understand why small businesses are concerned. CMMC can really feel expensive, complex, overwhelming, especially when larger integrators have more people, more tools, and larger budgets. I actually have a friend that is looking into becoming a government contractor. So we pulled open one of the uh, RFPs that were out there that he wanted to look into and see, what do I actually have to do? And there was about 100 different DFARS requirements that
Oh,
were in that contract, which made it so overwhelming for him to even understand. But really, SMBs can absolutely stay competitive and take this as a practical approach. First, they don't need to overscope. Understand exactly where that CUI lives and reduce the unnecessary exposure. The smaller, the cleaner your CUI environment is, the easier it is going to be to secure and assess. Second is prioritize the controls that create the most risk. If they're weak, multi-factor authentication, access control, vulnerability management, incident response, those types of things, it can be really challenging. So make sure you're starting to prioritize those controls. And then third, this is the biggest one is using partners wisely. SMBs don't need to build everything themselves. There's managed service providers, there's cloud service providers, there's GRC tools, CUI discovery tools, advisory organizations that can really accelerate a small business's readiness. But really, SMBs need to choose a partner carefully and make sure that those partners understand CMMC. And then the fourth thing I would say is start early. Don't wait until the prime asks you for proof to readiness. By then, the companies may be under contract pressure with a limited time to remediate. So the positive message I would say here for small businesses is CMMC can become a competitive differentiator. If you're a small contractor and you can prove that you can protect CUI, you become a low risk supplier to the primes and the Department of War.
we talked about 2019 earlier. Let's put our time travel hats on, go back to 2019. Travis could take his little bag, drive over to a company, walk in, and lots of stuff is pretty much there, maybe down the hall. I mean, it wasn't, it was pretty, compared to today, easy. You got cloud adoption, you got remote work, you got AI. All of a sudden, Travis is getting confused here. Where is the CUI stuff? You talked about it earlier. So how has this whole remote world impacted the way organizations should approach CMMC readiness?
Yeah, so I mean, from an AI cloud adoption, remote work perspective, it's really changed the CMMC conversation because the traditional network boundary has actually changed as well.
Yeah.
CUI is no longer sitting inside a corporate office or on a file server. It may be in the
Wasn't that
cloud
nice back
environment.
then?
Yeah,
It was nice back then, huh? Down the
exactly.
hall, Travis. Oh, thanks.
Yeah, yep. Rack 'em and stack 'em. It really may be in cloud environments or SaaS platforms, collaboration tools, ticketing systems, emails, endpoints, remote workstations, so on and so forth. But that means companies need to think differently about the scope, the control implementation. So for cloud, contractors need to understand whether the cloud environment is authorized. Is it meeting the FedRAMP moderate requirements or equivalency, how it's configured, who administers it, where the data is stored. And typically, when you're moving to a cloud, you're able to inherit a lot of controls like maintenance, media protection, physical protection. But once you go outside of that cloud, none of that matters. I would say also for remote workers, companies need to have strong identity controls, endpoint management, multi-factor authentication, encryption, and clear rules how their employees actually access and transmit CUI. And then the big one is around AI. So the key question is around data governance. Companies need to know whether CUI is entering AI tools, whether those tools are approved, how prompts and outputs are stored, and whether sensitive information can be exposed through unauthorized platforms. So the common theme here is CMMC readiness is really requires visibility. You can't protect what you can't see. Contractors need to understand their data flows, their users, their systems, their vendors, and their shared responsibility model with all the vendors that they're working with.
So, Travis, we talked about CMMC 2.0. I guess the implication is he's going to be a 3.0, maybe a 4.0. And so how can my listeners how can they project what this landscape is going to look like down the road? How can you prepare for the next evolution of CMMC?
Yeah, there is going to be new evolutions of CMMC. Right now, from a NIST 800-171 perspective, you're looking at revision 2. They've already come out with a NIST 800-171 revision 3, so there's going to be additional requirements and things that are going to happen and change the program over time. But I would say over the next 3 years, I believe federal cybersecurity will become more continuous, more automated, and more tied to contract performance. So CMMC is not going to be an end state. It's going to be a part of a broader movement towards continuous assurance. Contractors will be expected to prove more, not just that they passed an assessment, but they can sustain security over time. I also believe that there's going to be expected more pressure on the supply chain. So primes will need to increase their visibility to understand their supplier readiness. And there's already primes out there that are doing this. The suppliers will need to show credible evidence that they can protect CUI before actually receiving that sensitive information. And there will also be a greater use of automation. GRC platforms, continuous monitoring, AI tools. But technology alone is not going to solve the problems. Companies still need ownership, governance, accountability, and repeatable processes. So I would say my advice to prepare in 5 ways would be: number 1, know your CUI boundary. Number 2, build sustainable processes, not just one-time assessment projects. Also, assign an executive owner that can own this entire project within your ecosystem and organization. Validate that your suppliers and external service providers are also helping you meet the CMMC requirements and have shared responsibility models. And then treat cybersecurity as part of the business growth and contract readiness. But I would say the companies that succeed will be the ones that stop asking, what's the minimum we need to pass? Then they're going to start asking, how do we build a security program that protects the mission, supports growth, and earns trust across the federal government and supply chain? Finally, I think there's one of the biggest challenges over the next 3 years that won't be understanding the requirements. It will really be navigating the ecosystem needed to sustain compliance. So no single company can do everything on their own. I would say maybe the prime contractors, but it's going to be really difficult. Organizations need trusted advisors, managed service providers, cloud service providers, training organizations, technology platforms, assessment organizations, and understanding the defense industrial base. And that's really one of the reasons why here at Coalfire Federal, we actually built something called the CMMC Partner Assurance Network. The goal is to really provide organizations with access to a broad ecosystem of trusted partners that can help at every stage of your CMMC journey, from CUI discovery to readiness assessments to managed services. It really gives contractors and prime contractors greater visibility into the available resources without directing them to a single provider. It will help strengthen the overall resilience of the defense industrial base. And ultimately, cybersecurity is a team sport. The organizations that succeed in the next phase of CMMC won't be the ones that do everything themselves. They'll be the ones that are leveraging a strong ecosystem of trusted partners to reduce risk, accelerate readiness, and sustain compliance over time.
Good. Now, I think there's a document on your website called the CMMC Partner Assurance Network. I'll put a link to that in the show notes pages in case you're listening to this podcast and walking your dog. That's good practical advice. And the next 4 or 5 years are hard, but I think the conclusions you gave are very reasonable. There's going to be more continuous. There's going to be new developments. It's going to be more integrated, and no one's got all the answers. I would love to have someone have all the answers, and that's the reason you're on, to give our audience an option and choice to see a different way to skin the cat. And boy, it's going to be so many attacks coming up. I can't name them. Unfortunately, Travis, we're running out of time here. You have been listening to the Federal Tech Podcast with John Gilroy. I'd like to thank my guest, Travis Goldbach, Vice President, CMMC Coalfire Federal. Thank you, Travis.
Thank you, John. I appreciate you having me on today.